The summer Silas Bailey rode away from the Broken Spur Ranch. The sky over the Texas panhandle was the color of a bruise that refused to heal, and Eliza Sawyer stood at the fence line watching the dust his horse kicked up until there was nothing left to watch at all. She had not planned on caring. That was the honest truth of it. Eliza had arrived in Caldwell County in the spring of 1878, 2 years a widow, her husband Thomas Sawyer having died of a fever that swept through the lower settlements like an unwelcome guest who would not leave until he had taken something precious from every household he visited. Thomas had been a good man, quiet, steady. The kind of man who fixed a fence post before it leaned too far and never raised his voice unless it was to call the horses in from the pasture. She had loved him the way you love the ground beneath your feet, without thinking about it, because it was simply always there. When he died, she buried him under the cottonwood tree at the edge of their small property and sat beside the mound of fresh dirt for the better part of an afternoon before standing up, brushing the dust from her dress, and deciding that she would not fall apart. Falling apart was a luxury she could not afford. She had 30 acres of scrub grass and mesquite, a small house with a leaking roof, and a brother-in-law in San Antonio who had written exactly once to express his condolences and never again. She had a neighbor, old Me Hutchins, who brought her a pie the day after the funeral and then another one the week after that, and who possessed the good sense to sit and eat the pie alongside Eliza rather than simply delivering it and running. Me was 63 years old and had outlived 2 husbands herself, and she looked at Eliza the way a woman looks at someone who is standing at the edge of a difficult river, trying to decide if the crossing is worth it. It was me who told her about the Broken Spur. Man named Bailey owns it, me said, refilling their coffee cups from the pot on the stove. The stove was one of the things Thomas had purchased in the first year of their marriage, a good cast-iron range from St. Louis that Eliza kept polished and treated like the treasure it was. Silas Bailey. He is a decent sort from what I have heard, though I have not met him personally. He has been running about 400 head of cattle on that land for 3 years now, ever since he came up from Abilene. What does that have to do with me? Eliza asked. He is going north, me said. Cattle drive up through the Indian Territory and into Kansas. He will be gone 6, maybe 8 months, and he has no wife, no family in the county to speak of. He needs someone to watch the land while he is away, someone reliable, someone who knows cattle and knows how not to panic when things go sideways. You are describing yourself, Eliza said. Me laughed, a short, bright sound. I am 63 years old and my knees sound like a wagon wheel on a gravel road. I am describing you. Eliza had looked out the kitchen window at her 30 acres of scrub and thought about the money she had left, which was not enough to get her through another winter without doing something she did not want to do, which was ask for help from people who would give it with a look of pity she could not stand. She had grown up in a household where pride was worn like a second skin, and even grief had not managed to strip that from her. She met Silas Bailey the following Tuesday. He was not what she had expected. She had built a picture in her mind of someone older, more weathered, the kind of cattleman who had been worked down to sinew and sun-baked stubbornness. Silas Bailey was 31 years old, which was only 4 years older than Eliza, and he was tall without being imposing and quiet without being cold. He had dark hair that needed cutting and hands that told the whole story of a working life without a single word being spoken, and he looked at her when she introduced herself with the kind of direct attention that made her feel as though he was actually listening and not just waiting for her to finish talking. They stood at the fence that divided the Broken Spur from the road, and he told her what the job entailed with a plainness she respected. 2 ranch hands would stay behind, brothers named Cord and Hector Vasquez, both of them experienced and trustworthy. Her job would be to oversee the operation, make decisions about grazing rotation and water access, manage the supplies, and handle any problems that came up with the neighboring ranchers, of which there were apparently a few who had been watching the broken spur's water rights with more interest than was comfortable. "I pay fair," he said. "And I pay on my return, which I am giving you my word will be before the first frost." "What if something goes wrong while you are gone?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment, not as if the question offended him, but as if he was giving it the honest weight it deserved. "Then you handle it," he said. "That is what I am trusting you to do." It was the trust, she thought later, that decided her. Not the money, though the money was necessary. It was the fact that he had not added any qualifications to it, had not said handle it as best you can or handle it if you are able. He had simply said you handle it, as if the outcome was already settled, as if she was already the kind of person who could be handed an enormous responsibility and carry it without breaking. She told him she would take the job. He left in the third week of April, 1878, with 12 cowboys, 412 head of cattle, and enough supplies to get them through to Dodge City if the weather cooperated and the river crossings did not go badly. He shook her hand at the gate of the broken spur and nodded at Cord and Hector and told them to do what Mrs. Sawyer said. And then he was gone, and the dust settled, and Eliza Sawyer stood at the fence line and watched it until there was nothing left to watch at all. She went back to work. The spring was dry that year, drier than the old-timers said it ought to be. And by the end of May, the creek that ran through the eastern edge of the broken spur had dropped to a thin, dark thread that barely covered the rocks at its bottom. Eliza had Cord and Hector dig out the old watering troughs and redirect what flow remained into the main drinking areas, and she rode the fence lines herself every 3 days to make sure nothing was breaking down in the heat. She learned the land the way she had learned Thomas's face in the early days of their marriage, feature by feature, line by line, until she knew it in the dark by feel alone. The neighboring rancher, a man named Clarence Pitt who ran a smaller operation to the west, came by in June to have what he clearly intended to be an intimidating conversation about the broken spur's water access and whether it had always been properly allocated. He was a wide man with small eyes and the particular quality of voice that some men develop when they have spent too long talking to people who are obligated to agree with them. He arrived on horseback with 2 of his own men flanking him and looked down at Eliza from the saddle with an expression that suggested he expected her to be flustered. "I will need to see the deed and the water rights documentation," she told him, standing in the yard with her arms at her sides and the son at her back. "If you believe there is a legal question here, the proper course is to bring it before the county clerk, not to ride onto someone else's property and imply otherwise." Clarence Pitt blinked at her. He had not, it was clear, expected that particular sentence to come out of that particular mouth. "I am not implying anything," he said. "Good," Eliza said. "Then we understand each other. The documentation is in order. The water rights are recorded and have been since Bailey filed them 3 years ago. If you want to challenge them, the courthouse is in Harrington. It is open Monday through Friday." He left without further argument. Cord Vasquez watched from the barn doorway with an expression that Eliza could not quite read until he turned to his brother and said something in Spanish that made Hector laugh, and then she understood that it was admiration. She did not write to Silas Bailey about the encounter with Clarence Pitt. It had been handled. There was nothing for him to come home to on that particular front, and she saw no reason to trouble him with problems that were already solved. This became, over the months that followed, a kind of habit. The small crises that arose on the broken spur, a fence section blown down by a late spring storm, a sick calf that she sat up through 2 nights nursing back to health with Hector's help, a mare that went lame and needed careful tending. She addressed them and moved on and did not think about them as things that needed reporting. They were simply the work. The summer deepened into something relentless. July came in like a furnace door swinging open, and the creek dried to nothing by the first week of the month, and Eliza made the decision to drive the remaining cattle 2 miles north to the secondary water source, a natural spring on the higher ground that Cord had told her about in passing, almost as if he had forgotten to mention it until the moment it became critical. It was a hard 2 days of driving, just the three of them, but they moved the cattle and the cattle survived, and by the time August arrived with its particular brand of heat that made the air shimmer like water above the ground, the herd was watered and grazing on the sparse grass of the northern range. She wrote to Silas Bailey once, at the end of August, to inform him of the cattle's current position and the status of the water situation, and the fact that the herd had held at 409 head, having lost 3 calves in the early summer heat. She kept the letter factual and brief, because she had not been hired to write him long letters, and because she was, above all things, a practical woman. He wrote back from Kansas in September, a letter that reached her in early October, and which she read twice at the kitchen table before folding it and putting it in the drawer beneath the silverware. He thanked her for the report and for managing the water situation with the spring. He said the drive had gone well and that he expected to be back in Caldwell County before November. He asked if she had had any further trouble with Clarence Pitt, and when she did not write back immediately, it was because she was thinking about how to answer that question, because there had in fact been a second visit from Pitt in September, during which he had made a comment about the place being managed by a woman that she had answered with a level of directness she was not entirely sure she ought to commit to paper. In the end, she wrote back and said that the situation with Pitt had been quiet and that she expected it to remain so. This was not entirely untrue. It was quiet. She was simply managing it. Silas Bailey came back to the Broken Spur on the 12th of November, 1878, which was 3 weeks later than he had promised, and which had been explained in a brief letter from Kansas, saying that one of his cowboys had broken his leg in a wagon accident, and that he had stayed until the man had family to look after him. She had read that letter and thought, for the first time and against her will, that she wanted to know more about this man. That the detail about staying for the injured cowboy was the kind of detail that told you something real about a person. He rode in at mid-afternoon on a day that had turned gray and cold, the first real threat of winter pressing down from the north. Eliza was in the near pasture checking the fence line when she heard the horse and turned to see him coming up the road with 2 of the other cowboys from the drive, both of them headed for their own homes and branching off at the gate, while Silas continued to the house. He looked like a man who had been on the road for a long time. His coat was dusty, and his face was leaner than it had been in April, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that suggested a tiredness that was not just physical. She walked to meet him at the fence. He dismounted and stood looking at her for a moment in a way that made her feel briefly self-conscious, though she could not have said exactly why. "Mrs. Sawyer," he said. "Mr. Bailey," she said. "The herd is up on the northern range, 409 head. I moved them in July when the creek went dry and they have done well up there. Cord and Hector can give you the full accounting." He kept looking at her, not with the blankness of someone not listening, but with something more complicated than that, a kind of slow assessment, as if he was recalibrating something in his own mind. "You moved 400 head in July," he said. "The 2 of you and Hector." "The 3 of us," she said. "Cord, Hector, and myself. It took 2 days. It was not difficult, only hot." "In the drought," he said. "Yes, in the drought," she said. "The creek was dry. The northern spring was not. It made sense." He took his hat off and ran a hand through his hair, which still needed cutting, more so now than when she had last seen him. He looked at the winter-gray sky and then back at her and then at the land around him that he had left 7 months ago in her care. She watched him take in the state of the fences, the condition of the outbuildings, the neat orderliness of the yard, and she felt something strangely like anxiety, though she had no reason to feel it because she knew the work had been done well. "The roof on the bunkhouse," he said finally, nodding toward it. "That is new timber. A section blew down in a storm in June," she said. "I had Cord and Hector repair it before the summer heat settled in. The cost came out of the operating account." "It is itemized in the ledger." "The ledger," he repeated. "Yes," she said. "I kept a full accounting of everything. Costs, decisions, dates. It is on the table in the house if you want to review it." He put his hat back on and looked at her for another long moment. "Mrs. Sawyer," he said, "I have been riding for 3 days and I am not yet in a state to look at a ledger, but I would very much appreciate a cup of coffee if that is something that could be arranged." She felt the corner of her mouth move in what was, possibly, a small smile. "That," she said, "is something that can be arranged." The winter settled in around them that first week, and the arrangement that had been understood as temporary Eliza managing the broken spur while Silas was away became something less defined but no less real. She had her 30 acres and her house 2 miles east, and every morning she rode to the broken spur to check on the herd and discuss the day's work with Cord and Hector, and now with Silas himself, and every evening she rode home. It was a rhythm that felt natural without having been planned. He reviewed the ledger on his 3rd day back and came to find her in the barn where she was checking on a heifer who had been off her feed. He stood in the doorway with the ledger in one hand and his coffee cup in the other, and he looked at her with an expression she could not name but which felt somehow important. "Every decision you made here is in this book," he said. "Yes," she said, not looking up from the heifer whose nose she was examining for signs of infection. "Every one of them was the right call," he said. She looked up then because that was not what she had expected him to say, though she could not have said what she had expected. "I know," she said, and then heard how that sounded and added, "I mean, I believe they were correct at the time. It is good to have that confirmed." He almost smiled. She could see it in the slight shift of his expression, the way the tiredness around his eyes softened for just a moment. "You do not need my confirmation," he said. "That is what I am saying." She turned back to the heifer and did not answer, because there was something in his voice that she did not know what to do with yet. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was long and cold, and deeply still in the way that the Texas panhandle could be still in winter, as if the land was catching its breath. Eliza and Silas developed a working partnership that was closer to a friendship than either of them named it, because naming it felt like pressing on something that might crack under the pressure. They wrote the fence lines together when the weather allowed. They discussed the spring plans for the herd over the kitchen table in the broken spur house, which she had learned was far better equipped for warmth than her own smaller home, and she told herself that this was why she lingered there in the evenings longer than strictly necessary. She learned things about him slowly, the way you learn a language by living in the country where it is spoken. He had come from Abilene with money saved from 5 years of driving cattle for other men, determined to have land of his own. He had a mother in Missouri who wrote him letters he read carefully and answered dutifully. He had a scar on his left hand from a branding accident when he was 17. He did not drink much. He read when he had the time, keeping a small stack of books on the corner of his desk that she noticed and did not comment on because she read them with her eyes and was afraid that if she mentioned them he would know she had been looking. She told him things too, in her way. She told him about Thomas, not the grief of it but the substance of the man, the way he had been steady and good. She told him about her own family in Georgia, her father who had been a farmer before the war turned everything, her mother who had made the best of a great deal of circumstances that did not deserve her best. She told him about coming west with Thomas because Thomas had believed, as a lot of men did in those years, that the West was a place where you could make a thing from nothing if you were willing to work hard enough. Was he right? Silas asked once when she told him this. They were sitting on the porch of the broken spur house on a cold January evening, both of them wrapped in their coats, watching the last of the winter light leave the sky. "Partly," she said. "He made a thing. It just was not as big a thing as he had hoped for, and he was not alive long enough to see it grow." She paused. "I think he would have kept at it, though. He was not the kind of man to stop." "No," Silas said quietly, as if he understood that quality from the inside, and she thought perhaps he did. Spring came slowly and then all at once, the way spring in the Panhandle always did, and with it the second year of what was becoming an ongoing drought in the region. The rains that were supposed to come in March came only as a thin promise that wet the dust and then retreated, and by April it was clear that the water situation was going to be worse than the previous year. The northern spring, which had saved the herd in 1878, was already running lower than it ought to be for the season. Eliza tracked the water levels daily, cutting a notch in a stick she kept at the spring's edge and checking it every morning. She was doing exactly that when Silas found her there one morning in early May, crouched at the edge of the spring with her measuring stick, and she looked up at him and said, "We have lost 3 inches in the past 2 weeks." He crouched down beside her to look. "Same rate as last year. Faster," she said. They looked at the water together for a moment, which was not a romantic moment in any conventional sense, and yet felt, to Eliza, with a sharpness that startled her, like the kind of moment that matters. "There is a rancher about 12 miles north," Silas said, "a man named Garrett Hall who sank a well 2 years back. I have spoken to him about it. He would allow us access in an emergency." "How deep is the well?" she asked. 40 feet, he said. "Good water." He said the geologist who surveyed it told him the aquifer goes down another 60 beneath that. "Then we should speak to him now," she said, standing and brushing the grit from her knees, "rather than in an emergency." He stood too and looked at her in that way he had, which she was becoming used to without becoming immune to, that way of looking that felt like he was paying genuine attention to her. "You are always 3 steps ahead," he said. "I try to be," she said. "It is less work than catching up." They rode to Garrett Hall's place together the following day, and Garrett, who was a lean older man with a white beard and a daughter Eliza's age who brought them sweet tea, and looked between the two of them with a small knowing smile that Eliza pretended not to notice, agreed to share well access for a reasonable rate. It was a good arrangement, one that would carry the broken spur through the summer if the drought held as predicted, and the drought did hold. The summer of 1879 was worse than 1878, the grass going brittle and gold by June, the creek bed in the east of the property becoming a dry white scar in the landscape, the sky day after day, a hard, brilliant blue that offered beauty in exchange for nothing useful. Eliza managed the grazing rotation with a precision she had not known she possessed before necessity taught it to her, moving the cattle through the northern range in sections so that the grass could recover between grazings, keeping the herd back from the exhausted eastern pastures, organizing water hauling from Garrett Hall's well in the worst weeks of July and August. Cord and Hector were invaluable. She had come to know them well over the previous year, their habits and their strengths. The way Cord's experience with cattle was broader and Hector's with horses was deeper. The way they communicated with each other in a mixture of Spanish and English that she had picked up enough of to follow and occasionally contribute to, which had made Hector laugh with genuine delight the first time she had responded to something in Spanish without thinking about it. They were good men, both of them, and they had stopped treating her as a temporary arrangement sometime around the previous October, and started treating her as simply part of the broken spur, which was one of the nicest things that had happened to her in a long time. Silas was in and out through the summer of 1879. He had obligations in Harrington, business at the county seat, related to the water rights dispute that Clarence Pitt had finally decided to make official, and he was gone for stretches of a week or 2 at a time. During those stretches, Eliza ran the broken spur with the same calm efficiency she always did, and when he came back, he would find everything in order and she would give him a brief accounting of the important decisions, and they would sit on the porch in the evening, and he would ask questions about what she had done, and she would answer them, and he would nod and sometimes say something about his own time away. The lawyers in Harrington who were either competent or incompetent depending on the day. The county clerk who had a disorganized filing system that made locating relevant documents an adventure. She liked those evenings. She did not let herself think too carefully about how much she liked them. The water rights case dragged through the summer. Clarence Pitt had hired a lawyer from San Antonio who knew how to file papers in a way that made simple things complicated, and Silas's own lawyer, a local man named Aldridge who was honest but not particularly aggressive, was spending a great deal of Silas's money-generating delays of his own, while the fundamental question remained unresolved. Eliza read through the water rights documentation herself one afternoon, spreading the papers out on the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the kind of focused attention she applied to everything. And when Silas came back from Harrington 2 days later looking tired and frustrated, she told him what she had found. "The original deed language is quite specific," she said. "The boundary markers for the water access are described in terms of creek bed features rather than survey measurements, and 2 of those features, a particular bend and a large rock outcropping, have moved or eroded in the years since the deed was filed." Pitt's lawyer is arguing that this ambiguity invalidates the original claim. Silas looked at her across the table. "I know," he said. "Aldridge has been saying the same thing. But there is an answer to it," Eliza said, and slid a piece of paper across the table toward him. On it she had drawn a careful diagram. "The Geological Survey of 1876 mapped this region for the railroad, and their survey records are on file with the county. Those records show the position of the creek features as they were at the time your deed was filed. If the creek features have moved since then, that is a change in the landscape, not a change in the intended boundary. Your deed is to the water, not to the location of a rock. The natural feature descriptions were a way of identifying the water source, not limiting your access to a specific geographic point." He stared at the diagram for a long moment. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. "I read the deed," she said, as if it were obvious. "And then I read the Geological Survey report, which I found at the county library when I went in for supplies last week. I thought it might be useful." He looked up from the diagram at her, and the expression on his face was something she had not seen there before, something that went beyond the appreciation and the respect she had grown accustomed to, something that made the air in the kitchen feel briefly different. "Eliza," he said, her first name. He had not used it before, or perhaps he had once or twice, but she had not noticed it the way she noticed it now. "The document number is on the back of that paper," she said, because she did not know what to do with the way he had said her name. "Aldridge should be able to pull it from the county records." He looked at the back of the paper where she had written the document number in her precise handwriting, and he let out a long, slow breath. "You are extraordinary," he said, quietly, simply, as if it were a statement of fact rather than a compliment. She stood up from the table and took her coffee cup to the window and looked out at the parched summer land. "I read," she said. "That is all." Aldridge took the Geological Survey documentation to the judge in August, and the judge agreed that the original deed intent was clear and that the creek feature ambiguity did not invalidate the water rights. Clarence Pitt's challenge was dismissed. The broken spur kept its water. Silas came back from Harrington on the day of the ruling and told her about it in the yard while the evening light was going gold across the dry grass, and then he said, "Without that survey document, we would have lost." And she said, "But we did not lose," and he said, "Because of you." And she had turned away from the gold light and the way he was looking at her and said she needed to check on the heifer, who was due to calf in the next week, which was true enough. But that night, in her own house 2 miles east, lying in the bed she had shared with Thomas and which now held only herself, she thought about Silas Bailey in a way she had been not thinking about him for 8 months, with a clarity that surprised her with its simplicity. She thought about his hands and the directness of his gaze and the way he listened, and the way he had said her first name in the kitchen. She thought about how different he was from Thomas, not better or worse, simply different, and how that difference did not diminish anything that had gone before but existed alongside it, the way one season exists alongside the memory of the last. She told herself she would be careful. She told herself that the arrangement they had was good, and that good arrangements could be ruined by complications, and that she did not have the luxury of complicating things. She had her 30 acres and her independence, which was something Thomas's death had given her that grief alone could not have, and she was not eager to surrender it. She was still telling herself these things when the autumn of 1879 arrived, bringing with it cooler temperatures but no rain, and the third drought was already beginning to announce itself in the dryness of the earth, and the thinning of the grass, and the worry lines on every rancher's face in Caldwell County. The third drought was different from the first two. It was not merely dry. It was the kind of relentless withholding that made the land look like something had given up on it. The winter rains that normally recharged the springs and creeks came in 1879 to 1880 as nothing, and by the time the spring of 1880 arrived, Garrett Hall's well was lower than it had ever been, and the question was no longer about grazing rotation, but about survival. Eliza had been preparing since November. She had spoken to every rancher within 20 miles about water-sharing arrangements, drawing on the natural network of obligation and practical self-interest that held ranching communities together, the understanding that the man who helps you through this drought is the man you help through the next one. She had organized a communal water-hauling rotation with 3 other properties, their combined access to the remaining springs and wells making the total viable, even when any single source would not have been. She had worked out a feed supplementation plan with Cord and Hector, sourcing hay and grain from a supplier in Amarillo who could get it down the rail line to Harrington if someone arranged the payment and the pickup, which Eliza arranged in December so that it would be ready when it was needed rather than scrambled for in a crisis. Silas watched her do all of this with an expression that had been building in him, she suspected, since the previous November and probably before, an expression that she was increasingly unable to pretend she did not understand. He had stopped going to Harrington for stretches. He was present on the broken spur for most of the winter of 1879 to 1880, and she told herself this was because the cattle situation required it, which was partly true, and tried not to think about the other part. He was there in the mornings when she arrived. He was there in the evenings when she was inclined to stay. They talked about everything and nothing, about the land and the cattle and the neighbors and the water situation, and the books on his desk that she finally admitted she had been noticing, which led to a conversation about books that went on for 2 evenings and was one of the best conversations she could remember having. He had read most of the same books she had. He had opinions about them that were interesting and sometimes wrong, and she told him so, which made him laugh in a way that she had not heard from him before, a real laugh, unguarded, and the sound of it landed in her chest like something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. "You disagree with Dickens," he said, amused, leaning back in his chair with his coffee cup balanced on his knee. "Not with Dickens himself," she said, "with the ending of that particular novel. The sentiment is earned, but the timing is wrong. He resolves things too quickly at the end, as if he suddenly remembered he had to close the story and bundled everything together in the last 30 pages. That is a very specific criticism," he said. "I have read it 3 times, she said. "I have had time to develop specific criticisms." He looked at her across the table with that look, the one that had been building all winter. "Eliza," he said. "The hay shipment arrives on Thursday," she said. There was a pause. "All right," he said, and looked back down at his coffee, and she breathed. "But you cannot breathe around something forever. Eventually you have to either say it or not say it, and in Eliza Sawyer's experience, the not saying of things had a cost that accumulated quietly until it became unaffordable. It was February of 1880 when it happened, or rather, when it began to happen. It was one of those clear, cold nights that the panhandle produced in winter, the sky absolutely black between the stars. The cold settled in so completely that it felt like a presence rather than a condition. She had stayed late, not for any particular practical reason, But because they had been going over the water plan for the coming summer, and the conversation had moved from the water plan to other things, and then to nothing in particular, which was its own kind of conversation, and before she noticed, it was well past 9 in the evening. She stood up and reached for her coat from the peg by the door, and he stood up too, because he always did when she left, a courtesy she had registered without commenting on, and he took her coat from the peg and held it for her to put on. And when she turned around to put her arms through the sleeves, they were closer together than they had been before, or perhaps not closer in terms of distance but closer in terms of something else, and she could see the exact expression on his face, which was not the careful, managed expression he usually wore but something underneath it, and she held very still. "I need to say something to you," he said. His voice was quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up and was pressing against the windows with a low, persistent sound. "All right," she said. "I am aware," he said, "that you came here as an employee and that you are a widow and a woman of independent means, insofar as you have built those means yourself through your own work, and I am aware that nothing about what I am going to say is simple." She waited. "I think you know," he said, "what I am going to say." "I think I do," she said. "Then I am going to say it anyway," he said, "because I have been not saying it for long enough that the not saying of it has become a particular kind of difficulty." He looked at her steadily. "I love you. I am in love with you. I have been in love with you since somewhere around last November, possibly longer, possibly since you stood in my yard and told Clarence Pitt where the courthouse was, and that it was open Monday through Friday. I have not said anything because I did not want to make things complicated for you, and because you are the best thing that has happened to this land, and I was afraid that if I said the wrong thing you would stop coming." Eliza looked at him for a long, quiet moment. The wind pressed at the windows. "You should have said something sooner," she said. He blinked. "Is that a criticism or a response?" "Both," she said, and she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, feeling the roughness of his beard and the warmth of his skin in the cold room, and she watched the expression on his face change into something she would spend the rest of her life being glad she had the chance to see, and then she said, "I love you too. I have been fighting it since approximately the same time, and I am tired of fighting." He kissed her, and it was not the tentative, careful kiss of someone unsure of their welcome, but the kiss of a man who had been given something he had almost stopped hoping for. And she kissed him back with the same honesty, because she had decided some time ago that she was done being anything less than honest about things that mattered. When they separated, she was still wearing her coat because he had never quite finished helping her into it, and they both noticed this at the same moment, and something in the absurdity of it broke through whatever solemnity the moment had possessed, and they both laughed. And the sound of their laughter together in the warm kitchen with the winter wind outside was one of those moments that becomes, without any ceremony, a beginning. The spring of 1880 was one of the hardest the county had seen. The drought, which had been building through the 2 previous years, had by March of 1880 established itself as a genuinely severe emergency that reached across the whole region. The grass was dead in the eastern pastures. The northern range was thin. Garrett Hall's well was producing at a fraction of its normal rate. 3 ranchers in the county gave up entirely in February and March, loading their families onto wagons and heading for greener country to the north. Eliza's water-sharing arrangement was the difference between survival and those same wagons. The rotation she had organized with the neighboring properties gave every participating ranch just enough to keep their cattle going, not comfortably, not well, but alive. She was on horseback every other day in those months, riding between properties to coordinate the hauling schedule and check the water levels, and address the inevitable disagreements that arose when scarce resources had to be divided among people who were all under strain. She talked Garrett Hall through a moment of crisis in March when it seemed his well might finally give out entirely, sitting with him at his kitchen table with his daughter hovering in the background, and she drew on what she had read about well maintenance and spoke calmly and patiently about what could be done, and what probably could not be done and what they would do if the worst happened. And Garrett Hall, who was not a man who showed weakness easily, put his face in his hands briefly and said, "Thank God for you, Mrs. Sawyer," and she had said, "Thank God for the aquifer which is still there, which is the main thing. The well held, the water rotation held." By April, the feed supplement she had ordered from Amarillo in December was arriving on schedule at the Harrington Rail Depot, and she was organizing its distribution with the efficiency of someone who had been thinking about logistics for months. Silas watched her and rode with her and worked alongside her, and in the evenings when the work was done, sat with her on the porch of the Broken Spur house watching the parched sky and talking, and sometimes not talking, which was a kind of intimacy she had not expected to find in silence but had discovered was one of the deepest kinds. They had told Cord and Hector about their changed relationship with minimal ceremony. She had simply been there when Silas told them, and neither of them had looked surprised in the slightest, which told her something about how visible the situation had evidently been to everyone except the two people in it. Me Hutchins came by in March and sat at Eliza's kitchen table and looked at her with those clear eyes that had seen 2 husbands' worth of life and said, "You have the look of a woman who has made a decision." "I suppose I do," Eliza said. "A good one?" Me asked. "Yes," Eliza said without hesitation, "a good one." Me nodded and ate her pie and did not say anything further about it, which was exactly right. In April, on a Sunday afternoon when the wind had stilled, and the sky was the particular clear blue of early spring, Silas asked her to marry him. He did it without a great speech, which was characteristic of him, in the near pasture while they were checking on a group of calves that had been born in the previous weeks, new life happening stubbornly in the middle of the drought, which Eliza thought was perhaps the most fitting possible setting. "I want to marry you," he said, "if you are willing. I know what you have built here is yours, and I would not ask you to give any of it up. Your 30 acres will remain yours. We would be partners in every sense." She looked at him and thought about Thomas, who had been good and steady and gone too soon, and she thought about grief and how it changed shape over time, how it did not disappear but became something you could carry differently, and she thought about this man beside her in a drought-year pasture and the life that was possible with him. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." They were married in June of 1880 in the small church in Harrington, which was a modest building that nevertheless had a good quality of afternoon light through its windows, which Eliza noticed because she noticed things. Me Hutchins was there, and Cord and Hector and their families, and Garrett Hall and his daughter, and a small gathering of neighbors who had come through the drought together, and who were, in the way of people who have survived difficulty alongside each other, something closer to friends than mere acquaintances. The minister was a young man named Dawes who performed the ceremony with a sincerity that Eliza appreciated. Silas said his vows looking at her with that direct attention that had first made her feel genuinely seen, and she said hers looking back at him with the same honesty she had decided on in the cold kitchen in February. And when it was done, he kissed her with the same quality she had come to recognize in him, which was complete lack of reservation, and Me Hutchins made a quiet approving sound from the third pew that was almost certainly not as quiet as Me intended. The rains finally came in August of 1880, late and insufficient to fully reverse what the 3-year drought had done to the land, but real. Actual rain, falling on the dry ground of the Broken Spur on a Tuesday afternoon, when Eliza was in the kitchen putting up preserves from the small kitchen garden she had planted in the protected area behind the house, and she heard the first drops on the roof and went to the door and stood there watching the rain come across the land, watching the dust turn to dark patches where the drops hit, smelling the smell of rain on dry earth, which is one of the finest smells in the world. And she felt a complicated joy that was part relief and part something deeper, a kind of gratitude for the land and for the life she was living on it. Silas came in from the barn soaking wet, having apparently not moved fast enough when the sky opened, and stood dripping in the kitchen doorway looking at her with his wet hair pushed back from his face and an expression of such uncomplicated happiness that she laughed. "The creek will run again," he said. "Give it 3 days," she said. It ran in 2. The autumn of 1880 was the beginning of a different season in every sense. The land recovered slowly, the way land does, not dramatically but steadily, the grass coming back in the lower pastures as the water table began to slowly restore itself, the creek running clear and steady by September, the cattle fattening on the first real flush of autumn grass in 3 years. The herd was smaller than it had been when Silas had first ridden north in 1878. They had sold off some head in the worst of the drought months to keep the operation financially viable, a painful decision that Eliza had been the one to first articulate and which had been the right call. But the remaining animals were healthy and strong, and the spring calving season of 1881 promised a significant return. They talked through the winter about the future of the broken spur. Eliza brought her 30 acres into the combined operation formally, which gave the ranch better access to the road and opened up a section of the property that had been underused. She had ideas about the layout of the grazing rotation that she sketched out on paper at the kitchen table, ideas that incorporated what she had learned through 3 years of drought management, building in redundancy and flexibility rather than assuming that the next season would be like the last. Silas listened to her and asked questions and added his own knowledge, and the plans they made together were better than either of them would have made alone, which was something she had suspected was possible from their earliest conversations and which continued to prove true. Cord and Hector both stayed on through the winter of 1880 and into 1881. Cord had married a woman named Rosario from the town of Harrington the previous autumn, and Hector was courting a girl whose family ran a small farm to the south, and there was a feeling on the broken spur of expansion and future, of things being built rather than simply maintained. Eliza liked that feeling. She had lived in a defensive crouch for enough years, keeping things together with the minimum of resources, that the sense of building forward felt almost luxurious. In the spring of 1881, she told Silas that they were going to have a child. She told him on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with their coffee in the good light of the early spring that had come warm and promising that year, the rains of the previous August having done their slow work on the land through the winter, and when she said it, she watched his face the way she had become accustomed to watching his face, reading the truth of him in the expression he could not quite keep composed. He set his coffee cup down. He looked at her, and then he said, "Are you well?" Which was the first thing he said, which made her love him with a sharpness that caught her off guard, that he thought of her first. "I am very well," she said. "Doctor Pierce confirmed it last week." He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his, and she could feel the roughness of his palms, the calluses of the working life they shared, and she turned her hand over and held on to him. "I did not know," he said slowly, "that this was something I was wanting. I mean, I knew in the abstract, the way you know that you want good things in your life, but I did not know that I wanted this specific thing this specifically until just now." "That is a very long way of saying you are happy," she said. "I am more than happy," he said. "I do not have a word for what I am." The pregnancy was easy in the way that some are and hard in the way that working ranch life during pregnancy necessarily is. But Eliza was not a woman who rearranged her life for difficulties when the difficulties could be worked around. And Me Hutchins came over twice a week to help and to sit with her, and to offer the kind of companionship that is worth more than advice. The summer was generous that year, the rains coming on schedule, the grass green in a way the land had apparently forgotten how to be for 3 years, and the broken spur moved through the season with an ease that felt almost celebratory. Their son was born in November of 1881, on a cold, clear night when the stars were hard and bright above the broken spur, delivered by Dr. Pierce with Me Hutchins assisting and Silas in the adjacent room, engaged in the particular suffering of someone who wants very badly to help, and has been told with considerable firmness to stay where he is. When Pierce opened the door and told him to come in, he crossed the room in 3 steps and stood looking down at Eliza, who was tired and completely composed and holding a small wrapped bundle, and he could not speak at all. She looked up at him with the baby held against her. "You are going to have to say something," she said, "because you are frightening me with that expression." "He is perfect," Silas said. "He is," she said. "Come and see him properly." They named him Thomas, for the man who had loved her first and built the ground from which the rest had grown, and Silas agreed to this without any hesitation, because he understood that the past was not competition for the present, that Thomas Sawyer had been a good man who deserved to be remembered in the naming of a good child, and that this was not a contradiction of anything between himself and Eliza, but an extension of the honesty that was the best quality of what they had built together. Thomas Bailey grew through his first winter round and loud and determinedly present, and Eliza, who had thought of herself for 2 years as someone who kept things going alone, found herself daily surprised by the texture of a life shared, by the fact of Silas there every morning and every evening. By the way, the broken spur had become something she had not expected when she stood at the fence line watching the dust of his departure in April of 1878, and felt nothing more particular than the practical assessment of a job to be done. Cord and Rosario had their first child in the spring of 1882, a girl they named Marisol, who arrived 3 weeks after the spring calving season, and whose crying could be heard across the yard in the early mornings in a way that made Eliza smile, because she recognized the particular music of a household that had new life in it. Hector married his girl, whose name was Clara, in a ceremony at her family's farm in the autumn of 1882, and Eliza and Silas attended and danced badly at the celebration afterward in the field behind the barn, which Hector watched with tremendous satisfaction, having witnessed so much of the slow, careful progress of their relationship from the beginning. Mee Hutchins remained a constant, coming by twice a week as she always had, getting older in the way of someone who is aging well rather than badly, the lines on her face deepening but her eyes remaining absolutely clear. She held Thomas in her arms on her visits with the experienced ease of a woman who had held many children, and she looked at Eliza and Silas over the baby's head sometimes with an expression that was purely satisfied, as if this particular outcome had been apparent to her from the beginning, which Eliza strongly suspected it had. The broken spur grew steadily through the years of the early 1880s. The herd rebuilt from its drought-depleted numbers, reaching 500 head by 1883, and growing beyond that as the grazing management practices Eliza had developed proved their worth through successive seasons. The water infrastructure she had built during the drought years, the relationships with neighboring ranchers, the access agreements, the planned redundancy remained in place even in the wet years, because she understood that the next drought was a matter of when and not of if, and the systems you built in hard times were the ones that carried you through the hardest. Silas drove cattle north again in the spring of 1883, the first long drive since 1878, and when he told her he was going, she looked at him across the kitchen table where they had made so many of their decisions, Thomas playing on the floor with a wooden toy that Cord had carved for him, and she said, "You know what needs doing. I will handle things here." He looked at her with the particular look she knew, the one that had been building since April of 1878 and which had never stopped building, that looked at her as if she was still revealing things to him after 5 years. "I know you will," he said. "That is never in question. Come back before the first frost," she said. "And write if the crossings are bad." "I will," he said. He hesitated. "It will be different this time," he said. "Going." "How different?" she said. "In 1878 I was leaving a ranch," he said. "This time I am leaving home." He paused. "Those are not the same thing." She looked at him for a moment. Thomas made a sound on the floor and she looked at their son, who was intent on his wooden toy, and then she looked back at Silas. "No," she said. They are not the same thing. He kissed her goodbye in the yard with the same quality he brought to everything, completely, without reservation, and Thomas watched from the porch in Eliza's arms with the solemn attention of a nearly 2-year-old. And Cord and Hector were ready with the horses, and the drive assembled and moved north, and Eliza stood at the fence line watching the dust until there was nothing left to watch. But it was different this time. In 1878, the watching had been simply the end of a departure. Now it was something she recognized as temporary, the going away of someone who is coming back, which is a completely different experience. She stood at the fence for a shorter time than she had in 1878, because Thomas pulled at her collar and said something that sounded like Papa with a question in it, and she said, "He will be back before the frost, your father," and turned back toward the house and the work. Silas was gone 4 months. He wrote twice, once from the Indian Territory where the crossings had been difficult but manageable, and once from Dodge City where the cattle had sold at a fair price and the drive had been profitable. He said in the second letter that he was thinking of building the new barn they had discussed, the larger structure on the eastern edge of the property that would allow them to winter more cattle and reduce their exposure to future droughts. And he had priced the lumber and the hardware from a supplier in Amarillo who could deliver to Harrington by rail. He wrote with the detail of a man who is thinking about the home he is going back to, and she read the letter at the kitchen table with Thomas asleep in the next room and the autumn evening coming through the window, and she felt the fullness of it. He came back in October, a week before the first frost, which she had told him to do and which he had therefore done, and she was in the yard when he rode in and Thomas was with her, having developed by 18 months a determination to be wherever his mother was that both touched and occasionally inconvenienced her. The drive had been good. Silas looked healthy and brown from the summer, and he dismounted and kissed her, and then lifted Thomas from the ground and held him up while Thomas patted his face with both hands and said Papa with certainty this time, no question in it. She watched them, the man and the child, the afternoon light going gold around them in the way of October in the panhandle, and she thought about the fence line in April of 1878 and the dust she had watched until there was nothing left to watch, and about everything that had been built since then, the water systems and the grazing plans and the drought management strategies and the water rights victory and the ledgers and the marriages and the birth of a son. Built from the ground up over 5 years of hard work and honesty, and the slow, inexorable accumulation of 2 lives moving toward each other. "The herd is good," she told him when he set Thomas down and the boy took off at a determined totter toward the barn, following some imperative Eliza had given up trying to anticipate. "The eastern pasture has come back well. The spring calves are strong." "I know," he said, looking at her. "I can see it." "The lumber estimate is reasonable," she said. "I looked at the figures and I think we can break ground on the new barn in the spring without straining the operating account." "Eliza," he said. "The breeding records are updated," she said. "I reorganized them while you were away. They are much easier to follow now." "Eliza," he said again, softer. She stopped. "I have been gone 4 months," he said, "and I came home to a ranch in better condition than when I left, a son who knows my name, and my wife standing in the yard telling me about lumber estimates." She raised an eyebrow. "Is there something wrong with lumber estimates?" "There is nothing in the world wrong with lumber estimates," he said, and stepped forward and took her face in his hands, which were warm and rough and familiar, and looked at her the way he had been looking at her since February of 1880, when she had turned around in her own coat in the kitchen and found him impossibly close. "But I have been trying to tell you something since I rode in and you keep telling me about cattle." "What were you trying to tell me?" she said, though she knew. "That this," he said, meaning all of it, the yard and the land and the sound of Thomas somewhere in the direction of the barn and the October light, and the weight of the 5 years behind them, is every single thing I wanted when I left Abilene with enough money for 3 years and a plan, and it is more than I knew how to want." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment, The afternoon was still except for a faint wind and the distant sound of their son. "I know," she said, gently. Not dismissively, but with the fullness of someone for whom this is also true. "I know." He kissed her in the yard in the October light, and she kissed him back. And Thomas came running from the direction of the barn shouting something about a cat, which turned out to be Cord's barn cat, who had apparently produced a litter of kittens in the previous week. News which Thomas conveyed with the urgency that it clearly warranted, and they separated laughing and went to look at the kittens, which were in a pile in the hay, and which Thomas regarded with an expression of complete reverence. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was mild. The new barn went up in the early spring of 1884, the lumber arriving at Harrington on schedule, and Silas and Cord and Hector, and 2 men from neighboring ranches who came to help in the way of the region raising the frame in 2 days, while Eliza and Rosario fed everyone and managed the children who circulated through the whole operation with the inquisitive chaos of small people. It was a big structure, solidly built, and when it was finished, Silas stood in the yard looking at it in the late afternoon light, and Eliza came to stand beside him. "That is going to hold 300 head through a bad winter," she said. "It is," he said. "Good," she said, "because we are going to need it." He looked at her. She was not looking at the barn, but at the middle distance, the way she looked when she was calculating something. "What do you know?" he said. "The water levels at the spring are lower than they should be for this time of year," she said. "Not alarming yet, but the pattern looks familiar." He absorbed this. "How long?" he said. "A year before it matters," she said. "Maybe 2. But we should expand the water agreement with Garrett now while the water is adequate, and he has no pressure to negotiate hard. And we should talk to the Zimmerman family east of here. They sank a well last autumn, and it is producing well. Getting an arrangement in place now is better than trying to arrange it in a crisis." He looked at her sideways, and in the soft afternoon light she caught his expression, which was that same look she had been living with for 4 years, the look that was made of attention and admiration, and love in a proportion she would never quite be able to measure, because each time she looked back it seemed to contain something new. "You have already thought through the whole thing," he said. "Most of it," she said. "I need to know what water volume you think we will need if we push the herd to 550 head by next autumn, which I think we can do if the calving season is as strong as I expect." He told her. She filed it away. They went inside for supper, their son running ahead of them through the evening air. The spring of 1885 brought a second son, whom they named James, after Silas's father, who had died in Kansas when Silas was 16, and whom he spoke of only occasionally, but with a quality of feeling that told Eliza everything she needed to know about what the name would mean. James arrived in April, healthy and emphatic about his opinions from the first hour of his life, and Thomas, who was 3½ years old, received his brother with the careful solemnity of someone being given a great responsibility. Eliza recovered quickly, as she did most things, and was back to her full working routine within the month, though Mee Hutchins came every day during April and the first weeks of May, and was, as she had always been, more useful than she was intrusive, which was the exact right quality in a helper. Silas, watching Eliza move through those weeks with a newborn and a toddler, and the full weight of the spring calving season, and the beginning of what had started to look like a minor drought, developed a habit of stopping in the middle of whatever he was doing to simply look at her. He did not do it in an obvious way. He did it the way you watch something that surprises you every time you look at it directly, unable to entirely account for what you are seeing even though you have been seeing it for years. "You are staring again," Eliza told him one morning in May, nursing James at the kitchen table while Thomas ate his breakfast with the focused industry of a small boy. "Was thinking," he said. "About what?" she said. He considered this. "About how different things would be," he said, "if I had not needed someone to watch this place in 1878. She looked at him over James's head. "You would have found someone else," she said. "Not you," he said. Thomas looked up from his breakfast with the alert interest of a child who has detected emotional significance in adult conversation without being able to fully interpret it. "Mama," he said. "Yes," Eliza said. "More eggs," Thomas said. The emotional moment adjusted itself, and Eliza served more eggs, and Silas drank his coffee with the private expression of someone who had said the important thing and did not need to add to it. The drought of 1885 was not as severe as the droughts of 1878, 1879, and 1880 had been, and the preparations Eliza had made in the previous year proved their worth. The expanded arrangement with Garrett Hall and the new agreement with the Zimmerman family east of the Broken Spur meant that the cattle moved through the summer with adequate water, and the grazing management she had refined over 7 years of practice kept the land from the kind of damage it had sustained in the earlier droughts. The neighboring ranchers who had participated in the water rotation during the earlier droughts needed minimal assistance this time, having built their own preparations on the model Eliza had demonstrated. And there was something quietly gratifying in that, in the way that good practices spread through a community and became the ordinary way of doing things. Clarence Pitt had sold his ranch in 1882 and moved elsewhere, which the county had collectively processed with very little grief. The new owners of the Pitt property were a family named Sanderson who came from Missouri and who, Eliza established within their first meeting, were reasonable people who understood the importance of good neighbor relationships in ranching country. She had brought them a pie on their arrival, and then spent an afternoon explaining the water situation and the arrangements that existed in the county, and the Sandersons had listened and been grateful and become reliable participants in the network. By 1886, the Broken Spur was running 560 head of cattle and was one of the most efficiently managed ranches in Caldwell County, which everyone who had business dealings with it knew, and which Eliza was aware of without feeling the need to announce. The ranch hands had grown from Cord and Hector to a crew of 6, including a young man named Danny Price, who had come to them at 17 looking for work, and who was now 20, and showed a strong instinct for cattle management that Eliza was quietly cultivating. She taught Danny the same way life had taught her, which was through responsibility rather than instruction, giving him decisions to make, and then discussing them afterward without judgment, letting him develop the habit of thinking carefully and acting decisively that was the core skill of good range management. Silas watched her do this and recognized in it the same quality that had made her a good manager of the Broken Spur from the beginning, the ability to see what someone was capable of and to trust them toward it. Thomas started at the school in Harrington in the autumn of 1886, riding in with Eliza on the mornings she had business in town, and being collected by whoever was in town that afternoon. He was a serious child with his father's directness and his mother's precision, and his teacher, a young woman named Miss Aldgate, wrote in his first-term report that he was exceptionally attentive and somewhat determined to be right about everything, which Eliza read aloud to Silas at the kitchen table with the air of someone who sees a family trait perpetuating itself. "That is your quality," Silas said. "It is certainly not a quality that appeared from nowhere," she said. "You are always right," he said. "That is the inconvenient truth of it. I am not always right," she said. "I was wrong about the calving estimate in the spring of 1884. I thought we would have 40 new calves and we had 37. I do not think that counts," he said. "If you are going to cite a quality," she said, "you have to be willing to also cite the corrections." But she was smiling when she said it. James, at 2 years old, was the opposite of his brother in many ways. Loud where Thomas was quiet, physically reckless where Thomas was careful, prone to strong opinions expressed at volume about subjects as varied as the color of his plate, and the proper direction for the barn cat to travel across the yard. He was funny and affectionate and stubborn, and he wrapped himself around Silas's legs when his father came in from the range, with the kind of total physical commitment that was pure love without any self-consciousness. Eliza watched them, Silas lifting James and holding him on his arm while Thomas leaned against his other side with a book, and she thought about the fence line in April of 1878 and the dust she had watched without knowing what it would eventually become, and she felt the weight of gratitude, which is a different feeling from happiness and deeper. In the spring of 1887, Mee Hutchins died quietly in her sleep at the age of 72, in the house she had lived in for 30 years with her second husband and, afterward, alone. Eliza found her in the morning when she came for the regular Tuesday visit, and Mee had not answered the knock at the door, and she sat with her for a long time before riding to Harrington for the doctor and the minister. She organized the funeral with the same practical care she brought to everything, and she spoke at the service about a woman who had brought pie at the right moment and had known when to talk and when simply to sit, which was, she said, one of the finest and rarest human qualities she had ever encountered. She grieved for me honestly and without pretending she was not grieving, and Silas sat with her in the evenings in the way she had sat with many people through hard things, present without pressure, and she was grateful for it in a way she told him, because she had learned to tell him things rather than carrying them silently. Thomas was 6 that year and James was 2, and the Broken Spur was healthy and growing, and the community that Eliza had spent years building through drought and difficulty was its own kind of wealth, the network of obligations and friendships and shared practices that made the whole county more resilient than its individual parts. Garrett Hall's daughter, whose name was Patience, and who had looked between Eliza and Silas with that knowing smile in 1879, had married a man in Harrington and had 2 children of her own, and Eliza had attended both births in a supporting capacity, and Patience called her friend with the ease of someone who had simply decided this was so and proceeded accordingly. The summer of 1888 was a turning point in a different way. The railroad that had been pressing southward through the territory for several years reached Caldwell County in September of 1888, with a new branch line that ran through the southern edge of the county and created a rail depot at the town of Maries, 12 miles south of Harrington. This changed everything about the economics of the region. Cattle could now be shipped directly from the county rather than driven north to Kansas, which meant the long drives were less necessary, which meant the operational costs of a cattle operation dropped significantly. Eliza had anticipated this by approximately 2 years. She had been following the railroad surveying reports in the regional newspapers with the same focused attention she brought to water levels and weather patterns, and when the route became clear, she had begun preparing the Broken Spur's infrastructure for direct shipping, including a cattle loading facility on the southern edge of the property that would make the process efficient when the time came. Silas had overseen the construction. It was ready in August of 1888, a full month before the rail depot opened in Maries. When the first cattle from the Broken Spur went out by rail in October of 1888, it was a different kind of moment than the long drives had been, less romantic in the sense of hard travel through open country, but more clearly the future. Silas stood at the loading facility watching the cattle go, and Eliza stood beside him, James on her hip, though he was now almost 3 and heavy enough that it required some commitment, Thomas at her other side, asking careful technical questions about the railroad that she answered accurately because she had read about it. "The drives are done," Silas said. It was not exactly a loss, it was more like the acknowledgement of a change that carries its own weight. "The drives were how it was done," Eliza said. "This is how it will be done now. The cattle do not care how they get to market as long as they get there in good condition." He looked at her and smiled, the real unguarded smile she had first heard as a laugh in the cold kitchen in January of 1880. "No," he said, "they do not." Thomas had a question about the steam engine that took them all back to the practical present, and they walked along the rail line answering it, and James fell asleep on Eliza's hip despite the noise, which was one of the talents of small children, and the October afternoon moved through its light. By 1889, Eliza was 38 years old and Silas was 42, and the Broken Spur was a well-established operation that Cord and Hector and Danny Price ran with increasing independence, which freed Silas and Eliza to think at a longer range. They talked about expanding the breeding program, about the quality of cattle rather than simply the quantity, about selectively improving the herd over years rather than decades. These were conversations about a future that stretched past the immediate horizon, conversations that required stability and confidence to have, and they had them at the kitchen table in the evenings after the children were in bed, the lamp casting its light across the ranch ledgers and the breeding records, and the cups of coffee that were the material furniture of their shared thinking. Thomas, at 8 years old, had developed a serious interest in mathematics that his teacher reported with something between admiration and mild concern, the concern being that he corrected other students' arithmetic, which Eliza addressed with a direct conversation about the difference between being capable and being kind. Thomas considered this with the gravity he applied to everything and then said, "Is it not kind to correct an error?" And she said, "It is a kindness if it is done with care. It is not a kindness if it makes someone feel small." He thought about this for several days and then reported back that he had helped a classmate with an arithmetic problem rather than simply correcting him, and the classmate had been pleased rather than embarrassed. Eliza said that was exactly right, and Thomas filed this information in the careful way he filed everything, which told her it had actually been received. James, at 5, was still loud and physical and full of the kind of energy that expressed itself in running, climbing, and the enthusiastic investigation of anything that moved. He had the Broken Spurs horses thoroughly mapped by personality and preference, could tell you which one liked its ears rubbed, and which one preferred a firm pat on the neck, and he followed Cord around the barn with the devotion of a small apprentice, learning rope techniques and animal handling with the absorption of someone for whom this is already natural. In the spring of 1890, Eliza discovered that they were expecting again, which at 39 she received with the mixture of joy and practical assessment that characterized her approach to most things. Dr. Pierce confirmed good health and no obvious concerns, and she organized her schedule to distribute the most physically demanding work through Cord and Danny, while keeping the oversight and decision-making functions that she did not intend to surrender. Silas took the news with the same quality he had taken the news of Thomas and James, which was complete attention and immediate concern for her well-being. "Are you certain you are all right?" he said, and she said yes. She was 40 years from certain, and he laughed and took her hands. The baby arrived in November of 1890, a girl this time, who came into the world in the same room where both her brothers had been born, with the same November stars outside the window that had attended Thomas's arrival 9 years before. They named her Me, for the woman who had brought pie at the right moment and known when to sit, and Patience Hall's daughter, who was now Patience Morrison, came to see her and held her and said that Me Hutchins would have been entirely satisfied with this. Eliza thought that was probably right. The Broken Spur moved into the 1890s with the solidity of something that had been built through hard seasons and had not simply been handed to them. The drought years of 1878 to 1880 had formed the foundation of everything that followed, not because hardship builds character in some abstract sense, but because the specific decisions made in those specific droughts, the water agreements, the grazing management, the feed planning, the legal defense of the water rights had created a resilient infrastructure that carried the ranch through every subsequent difficulty. Eliza did not think about this in terms of her own contribution, because she was not the kind of person who organized her thinking around personal credit. She thought about it as simply the ranch being well managed, which it was, which had always been what she intended. Silas thought about it differently. He thought about it in terms of what the ranch would be if she had not been the one watching it through 3 droughts, If he had hired someone less capable or less committed or less willing to think 3 steps ahead of a problem. If he had come home in November of 1878 to a herd in worse condition, and water rights lost to Clarence Pitt, and the whole trajectory of the broken spur going a different direction. He thought about this not with any drama, but with the steady appreciation of someone who understands specifically what they have, and specifically how they came to have it. He tried to tell her this on their 10th wedding anniversary, which was in June of 1890, before the news of the 3rd child, and he did not do it well, which he admitted. He said something about gratitude and the ranch and her, and it came out more like a ledger entry than a declaration, which was his particular failing when he tried to be formal about things he felt deeply. She listened to him work through it with the patient attention she gave to his attempts at expression when the subject was important to him, and when he stopped, slightly frustrated with himself, she said, "I know what you mean." "It did not come out right," he said. "It came out as you," she said, "which is what I prefer." He looked at her 10 years in the kitchen of the house they had made together, and he said, "I came home from that first drive in November of 1878, and you gave me an accounting of the cattle and the water and the fencing and the ledger, and I could not find words enough." He paused. "I still cannot. I have been trying for 12 years, and the words are never quite enough for what I mean." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, Thomas and James could be heard in the yard in whatever game occupied them, their voices threading through the June afternoon. "Then stop trying to find enough words," she said. "The words you have are fine, I know what they mean." He reached across the table and took her hand in the way he had in the spring of 1881 when she told him about Thomas, and she held onto him in the same way. "The ranch is good," he said. "Our children are good, you are good." "We are good," she said. "All of it, we are good." Me grew into a bright-eyed, quick-thinking child, who had her mother's capacity for focused attention and her father's directness, and a humor that belonged entirely to herself, which manifested by the time she could put 3 words together as a dry observational quality that made the adults around her laugh before they could stop themselves. Thomas at 9 and James at 5 received her with varying degrees of interest, Thomas examining her with the solemn attention of someone assessing a new phenomenon, James attempting to share his breakfast with her within the first week of her life, which had to be gently redirected. The house on the broken spur was full and warm and real. The ranch that Silas had left in Eliza's care in the spring of 1878 had become something that neither of them could have fully imagined in those early careful days of handshakes and ledgers, and the direct exchange of trust between 2 people who did not yet know what they were building. It had been built through drought and difficulty and the accumulated small decisions of daily work, through the water agreements and the breeding programs and the fence repairs, and the hay shipments and the legal victories and the kitchen table conversations in the lamplight, through the slow movement of 2 lives toward each other and then together. Danny Price, who had come to them at 17 and was now in his mid-20s, managed the southern range with the independence of someone who had been taught to think by someone who thought well, and he had his own thoughts about expanding the breeding program that Eliza encouraged and refined. Cord and Hector were both settled and prosperous and present, their families part of the extended life of the broken spur, their children growing up alongside Thomas and James and me in the way that children do when they share land and work, and the daily proximity of a working ranch. There was an inequality in this that Eliza was not oblivious to, the difference between owning land and working it, and she had ensured over the years that the wages on the broken spur reflected the value of what Cord and Hector and Danny brought to it, which was substantial, and that they were treated as the skilled professionals they were rather than as interchangeable labor. This was not generosity in her mind, but simple accuracy about what things were worth. Silas grew older in the way of men who work outside, the lines on his face deepening, and his hair going silver at the temples and his hands becoming more thoroughly marked by their history. And Eliza thought he was more himself at 42 than he had been at 31, in the way that some people become more themselves as they age rather than less. She told him this once, when he was standing at the mirror one morning with an expression that suggested mild discontent with what he saw, and he looked at her reflection and said, "You are saying that age agrees with me." And she said, "I am saying that you look like someone who has done the thing he was meant to do, which is not the same as simply getting older." She did not spend time at mirrors with similar thoughts because there was generally something more practical demanding her attention. But she was aware, in a way that did not trouble her, of the changes in herself, the gray that had begun to thread through her hair in her late 30s, the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the small physical record of years of outdoor work and 3 children, and the ongoing demands of a working life. She wore it the same way she wore everything, without ceremony and without apology. Thomas went to study in Harrington at 16, boarding with a family there during the school terms, and coming home for holidays and summers, where he promptly engaged in lengthy and detailed conversations with Eliza about whatever he was learning and with Silas about the ranch, and spent considerable time with his younger siblings with the particular combination of patience and exacting standards that was entirely characteristic. James at 12 was clearly going to be a rancher in the most physical and instinctive sense, more comfortable with horses and cattle and the open range than with schoolrooms, though Eliza ensured that he had enough schooling to read and write and calculate with precision because she believed those were tools, not ornaments, and tools were not optional. Me at 3 was in everyone's business at all times and was unanimously adored. The spring of 1894 was a good year. The rains came on schedule, and the grass came up thick, and the calving season produced more healthy animals than the Broken Spur had seen in several years. Danny Price, now 28, was effectively running the daily operations with Cord and Hector, and Silas and Eliza had moved into the kind of senior role that allowed them to direct at a strategic level, while the daily work was in capable hands. They rode the fence lines together on a clear April morning, just the 2 of them, which was a thing they still did regularly because it was theirs, one of the constant practices of their life together. The grass was green on both sides of the fence, and the sky was that particular shade of spring blue that comes after a good winter and before the heat, and the creek in the east was running clear and full, and the whole of the Broken Spur stretched around them in the morning light. Eliza pulled her horse up at the top of the low rise that gave the best view of the whole property, the way she sometimes did, to look at it all from a distance. Silas pulled up beside her. She looked at the land for a long time without speaking. The new barn in the east, the loading facility in the south, the careful rotation of the grazing fields, the windmill Silas had put in the previous year to supplement the spring, the house with its better roof and its added rooms, the garden that was just beginning to show green behind the kitchen, the whole accumulated physical record of years of work. "I remember watching your dust," she said finally. He looked at her. He understood what she meant. "April of 1878, he said. "Yes," she said. "I stood at the fence and watched until I could not see anything. And then," he said, "and then I went back to work," she said, "because that was what there was to do." He looked at the land alongside her. The morning was absolutely still except for the sound of the horses breathing and a meadowlark somewhere in the grass below them. "I came home in November of that year," he said, "and you gave me the whole accounting in the yard before I had even taken my boots off. The herd numbers and the water and the fence and the ledger, all of it. It needed reporting," she said. "I stood there," he said slowly, "and I listened to you describe everything you had done on that land while I was gone, and I wanted to say something that was equal to it, and I could not find the words." He looked at her sideways. "I still cannot find the words that are equal to it." She met his eyes. 16 years of marriage, 3 children, 5 droughts between the first one and now, the law and the ledgers and the long drives and the kitchen table conversations in the lamplight. All of it, all of the accumulated weight of a shared life. "You do not need words equal to it," she said. "You never did." "Then what do I need?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. This man who had trusted her with 400 head of cattle and a spring that was running low, who had kissed her in the cold kitchen in February of 1880 without reservation, who had stood in a November room and called their first son perfect, who had come home from 4 months on the drive and tried to say something important about lumber estimates and not managed it and said it another way instead. This man who was more himself at 45 than he had been at 31, and whom she loved with the completeness of someone who has arrived, fully, at the place they were always going. "You need nothing," she said. "You have everything. We both do." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and they sat for a while longer on the rise above the broken spur with the April morning all around them, looking at the land they had made together. And it was, in every way that mattered, enough. Thomas came home from Harrington for the summer that year with a girl, a quiet, thoughtful young woman named Alice who was studying to be a teacher, and who looked at Thomas with an expression that Eliza recognized with a mixture of amusement and deep gladness, the expression of someone who has found the place where they belong. She took Alice aside one afternoon while the men were out checking on the cattle and made sweet tea and sat with her on the porch and talked to her honestly about ranch life and what it required and what it gave. And Alice listened with the focused attention of someone who was taking a real accounting, not a romantic one. And when she was done, Eliza said, "It is a good life if you want it. Make sure you are certain you want it before you choose it." Alice said she was certain. She said it looking at Eliza with an expression that was direct and unafraid, and Eliza thought of a fence line and a handshake and a job taken on because the trust in the offer had been worth more than the money, and she thought that the young woman sitting across from her was going to be just fine. James at 14 showed no sign of going anywhere for school or study or anything that took him off horseback, and Silas was negotiating this with the patient reality of a father who understands that some children are made for one kind of life and some for another. Danny Price was teaching him seriously, with the same method Eliza had used to teach Danny, and James was absorbing it with the wholeness of someone learning the language they were born to speak. Me at 4 had developed specific opinions about the kitchen garden that Eliza was cultivating with careful attention, and her contribution to the spring planting was enthusiastic and not always entirely helpful and entirely welcome. She narrated everything she did as she did it, a running commentary on the world as she encountered it, and Eliza worked alongside her in the kitchen garden in the mornings and let the narration wash over her and answered when answers were called for and felt the luxury of this ordinary thing, this morning, this child, this garden, this life. The broken spur stood in its valley in the panhandle in the spring of 1894, as it had stood since Silas Bailey had built the first structure there in 1875, but it was not the same place it had been. It was larger and more resilient and more deeply rooted, and the roots were not only in the soil, but in the network of relationships and agreements and practices that spread out from it through the county, and in the children who would carry it forward, and in the daily, ordinary presence of 2 people who had found each other through the most practical of arrangements, and had made from that arrangement something that neither of them had words enough to fully name. Silas Bailey had ridden away in April of 1878 with 412 head of cattle and a plan, and had come home in November to something he had not planned at all, which was the beginning of the rest of his life, delivered to him in the form of a woman who stood in his yard in the November cold and gave him a full accounting of the cattle and the water and the ledger, and looked at him with eyes that had not asked for anything. He had not found the words then. He had not found them in the kitchen in February of 1880, or at the fence in June of 1880, or in November of 1881 when he held his first son, or in any of the 100 evenings since then on the porch with the land going dark around them and the coffee going cold in their cups. He had kept trying, because some things deserve the attempt even when the words are never quite enough, and she had kept receiving those attempts with the patient clarity of someone who understood what was being said behind the saying of it. They rode back down from the rise together in the April morning, their horses moving through the green grass toward the house where their daughter was in the kitchen garden narrating the world, and the spring was running clear in the east, and the new barn stood solid against the sky, and the meadowlark sang from somewhere in the grass and did not stop. Everything was accounted for. Everything was in the ledger. The water was running, and the grass was green, and the herd was good, and the children were good, and all the long-ago dust of a departing cattle drive had settled, finally, into the ground from which it had risen, become the very earth on which they walked. Eliza Sawyer Bailey rode down from the rise with her husband's hand in hers and thought, as she sometimes did in these moments of particular fullness, about Mee Hutchins and her pie, and the question she had asked across the kitchen table in the spring of 1879. A good decision. Yes, a good one. The best, she might now say, without any exaggeration, without the false modesty that was itself a kind of dishonesty. The best decision she had ever made, which had not felt like a decision at the time, had felt like a job taken on because the trust in the offer was real. Love, she had learned, was not always announced. Sometimes it arrived disguised as a practical arrangement and a handshake at a fence line, and you only recognized it for what it was after you had been living in it for long enough that you could not imagine having lived any other way. She recognized it. She had recognized it every morning for 14 years when she rode to the broken spur in the early light and saw the house with its smoke from the kitchen stove and heard the ordinary sounds of work and life. She recognized it in the ledgers and the water plans and the breeding records and the kitchen table conversations. She recognized it in her husband's hands and the way he listened, and the way he looked at her when he had something he wanted to say and could not find the right words. She recognized it now in the April morning in the green grass and the running creek and the meadowlark's song, in the sound of Mee's voice carrying from the kitchen garden, and the knowledge that this, all of it, was hers and his, built from the ground up, from drought to rain, from a fence line to a table to a bed to a life. It was more than enough. It was everything.